Today's lesson, we're going to discuss the properties of an isosceles triangle as well as an equilateral triangle. First thing we're going to start with is an isosceles triangle. Again, a review, an isosceles triangle is a triangle with exactly two sides congruent. All right, so that would be like these two sides being congruent, and those are called the legs. Fix that. So this is a leg, and this is a leg. Now the side that's not congruent to the other two, we call that the base. Okay, now, down here in the corner, across from the two legs and attached to the base, it's called the base angles. Alright, and then up here, the angle that comes together with the two legs is called the vertex angle. So there's some basic terminology. Okay, so let's continue and talk about something called the isosceles triangle theorem. What the isosceles triangle theorem states: if two sides of a triangle are congruent, then the angles opposite those sides are also congruent. So basically what this is saying is that the base angles of any isosceles triangle are congruent. Now the converse of that states if two angles of a triangle are congruent, then the sides opposite those angles are congruent. It's the same concept. These kind of go back and forth with each other. But the main idea is that the base angles of an isosceles triangle are always congruent. Next we have something I like to call the vertex bisector theorem. So again, if we have an isosceles triangle, I know the base angles are congruent. Now if I take and I bisect the vertex angle, so if I bisect that, meaning it's going to cut that angle, the vertex angle, into two equal angles. Now two things happen. Number one, it creates a 90-degree angle at the base, and it also cuts the base into two congruent parts. Next, we're going to talk about an equilateral triangle. An equilateral triangle is a triangle with all three sides congruent. Okay? An equiangular triangle has all three angles congruent. And every equiangular triangle, these are always 60 degrees. Because the three angles of a triangle have to equal 180. And since there's three equal angles, we divide that by 3, and that's how we get our 60 degrees. Now, if a triangle is equilateral, it is also equiangular, and vice versa. If a triangle is equiangular, then that triangle is also equilateral. So I can go ahead and mark these angles congruent, and over here I can mark these sides congruent. Okay, so let's try some examples applying that knowledge. So for number one here, we have an isosceles triangle. All right, these two angles right here are our base angles. And since those angles are congruent, then I know that the sides opposite those angles are congruent. So if this side is 7, then this side is also 7. Okay, next example, we have another isosceles triangle. So these two sides are my congruent legs. So that means across from those two sides are my base angles, which I know are congruent. Okay, so if this angle is labeled X, that angle is also x. So to figure this out, I'm going to figure out what these base angles are. I know that triangles add up to 180, so I'm going to subtract 40 from 180. That gives me 140. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide that by 2 because there's two equal angles. So both of these are 140 divided by 2, which is 70. Okay, number 3 is very similar. Again, we have an isosceles triangle. These two angles down here are the base angles. That means these two sides are congruent. And 110 is my vertex angle. So again, I'm going to subtract 110 from 180. That gives me 70. And then since there are two base angles, I'm going to cut that in half to get 35 degrees for those two angles. Okay, in my last example here we have again an isosceles triangle. Two sides are equal. That means that the bottom angles down here are the base angles. Those are the same, okay? And you can see this dotted line here is bisecting the vertex angle. That's why it's 90 degrees at the bottom. So angle Y would also be 90 degrees. Okay, now to figure out my base angles, if this angle up here is 10, I know the other one is also 10, making the entire vertex angle 20 degrees, right? 10 plus 10. So again, I'm going to subtract the vertex angle from 180. That gives me 160. And then divide by 2 to get my two base angles, which are going to be both 80 degrees. And that concludes the lesson on isosceles triangles and equilateral triangles. Have a nice day.